this is the beginning of Pentecost, when everybody is gathered and they are afraid and they are nervous, and then they sense this call to something more. Listen with me as we prepare to pray. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jewish folks from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, a crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in their native language. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Aren't all these folks speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power and presence and love." And all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" Will you pray with me? Gracious and generous God, in the spaces of confusion, we are amazed and perplexed. Grant us open ears that we might hear new words and new voices. Grant us a presence of courage in our moments of uncertainty and fear, that we might listen to those whispers that well up from our gut, that nudge us to say something, to do something, to be something, to show up somewhere. Grant us the courage to hear your presence of love that speaks through our neighbors and our community, that whispers, that echoes, that chants, that protests, that asks, that we might turn over the tables and make a world of peace and justice and abundance for all. May it be so. Amen.
My name is Grayson. This is my poem on protest. I reach for those who break olive branches, climbing to something soft and plentiful. I cling to those who would rather snap their wrist than leave their siblings the short end of the wishbone. I sing for the smaller version of me who is indescribably larger than the gaping mouths without teeth, preaching about inevitability, but lacking the ability to chew. I search for a mirror to hold up to our youth, to turn our flushed faces to the left and right, so both sides can bask or shrivel in beams of hope for a tomorrow where the climbers are free.
I like in the program that it says Dr. Aaron Feitstinger, PhD, because I like to double up on my credentials, particularly in Nebraska. I usually only make old white men to call me that. So for those of you in the audience, otherwise Aaron is fine. My pronouns are she, her. Very excited to be here. I was kind of shocked that Rev Deb asked me to do this because I'm the policy director at the Women's Fund of Omaha, which basically means I'm a lobbyist for advancing gender equity in the state of Nebraska. So I'm always winning. And nothing really sets me on fire because it's going great. Speech ended. No, I'm just kidding. I spend most of my professional days in rooms and buildings filled with wind and fire. And in our current political moment, I feel like I'm usually the one who sounds like I'm speaking in tongues. Because while I find most of my fulfillment in the fight, I am also constantly furious about the fact that in almost every instance, we have been here before, and we have been faced with the same choices. And we know the outcomes of one choice or another, and yet, as Kurt Vonnegut says, well, here we are, trapped in the amber of the moment. There is no why. He was a little bit of a nihilist, and I appreciate that about him. But every day we get to make a choice, and that choice is to make community possible, to choose to continue this grand millennia-long experience, to live together somehow with all of our weird complexities and differences. I can feel my hand shaking, which is funny because Jill here in the front just told me Erin never gets nervous. I get nervous speaking in front of people all the time, and for some reason it's my professional career. So, what I'm saying is just embrace it. Live for it, embrace the shaking hand. Here we go. Before I worked in politics, I worked in academia, which isn't that much different, as a history professor, and I asked my students to use the Bible as a primary source, which teaching at a Catholic university offended some of them, but we moved forward. To use the Bible as a primary source to think about what these stories tell us about the time in which they were created and the people who created them. I am always asked to talk about policy, and that's fine. I'm pretty good at it. But I'd like to indulge the history professor side of me, if you'll allow me, because I've always found meaning in teaching, learning, and helping others make sense of otherwise seemingly unintelligible things. How the legislature works, the organizational structure of the city of Omaha, 17th century English politics, the radical religion of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. I'm happy to talk about that at length. Otto von Bismarck and the unification of Germany, another fun topic. And why Peter Gabriel is the more talented member of Genesis. I get irrationally angry about that discussion. And nobody ever asks. It's usually like, I like the Tarzan soundtrack, and I'm like, wait a second. Fulfillment in the fight, as I said at the beginning. Anyway, as I always told my students, history is the great soap opera of humanity. The people who came before us, they lived, they died, they fell in and out of love, they raised kids, they liked good food. They cried when they were sad, they had their feelings hurt, and they got scared. And they were faced with a lot of the same basic choices that we are. How to make sense of any of this. How to survive when the systems of power want to hurt you. How to respond when faced with new and strange things. How to treat people who are different than us, as neighbors or as barbarians. I spend a lot of time wandering around legislative bodies, and truly there's a couple people in here who know I am usually just wandering around. Finding places to put cheese in Lillian's fridge, things like that. That's an inside joke. Now you've all been led into it. Good job. I talk to elected officials. I try to convince them, for the most part, that they have a choice at any given moment to make society possible for all of us or continue to make it work for only a select few. And it's weird to do this with the context of history behind me because of the feeling that none of this is new. When society feels unstable, weak and uncurious leaders will find someone to blame to distract us all from the fact that their absolute power corrupts absolutely. The Greeks conceptualized the polis, their city-states, as all-encompassing communities which worked only if you were considered on the inside, not the barbarians outside the gates. The Romans built the Colosseum, bled their people dry while giving them bread and circuses, which feels very relevant to this current moment, minus the bread. We're not doing great at that part. In the English Civil War, royalists published stories of monstrous births in rebel strongholds, a sign surely that God had cursed the cause of revolution. Rich white planters in America got nervous that white indentured servants and African slaves were realizing they had more in common with each other than with the planter, and so we got the concept. We see the justification of slavery on the basis of race. Suburban housewives in the 50s knocked doors and went to school board meetings to eradicate what they perceived to be communist teachers and communist curriculum, to protect their children, so to speak. And now we are here. There is nothing new under the sun. I often take hope in the knowledge that despite some pretty spectacular attempts in our history, we have survived as a human race. And we have survived because in our darkest and most terrible moments, we have chosen every day to make society possible, even if it takes an incredibly long time to get there. We have rejected attempts by despots, found common cause with our neighbors, opened our hearts to difference. We have tried to be curious. Right now, though, there are too many people, too many elected officials who aren't making those choices to survive. I can tell you from experience that some of the darkest worldviews exist in rooms where decisions are made. because the people who make them are scared, and they are scared for the same reason people with power have always been scared, by the prospect that society isn't actually possible because of their power, but rather in spite of it. My dissertation supervisor at the start of his lecture on the Holocaust, he wore a full three-piece suit and a watch chain. It was a whole thing. He was a tiny little man, kind of like my size, but he had the three-piece suit, and I look like I'm dressed to play Nintendo all the time. Which is dress for the job you want, you know? Anyway, it's gonna take a dark turn after that Nintendo joke. At the start of his lecture on the Holocaust, he told students that the Holocaust didn't start at Nuremberg. It started in the line at the grocery store, when our kids see the way and heard the way that we treated others around us. And I think about that a lot, about those everyday choices that we make to be kind or not, and what that choice means about our continued survival. The great soap opera of humanity has always kind of been the story of hiding in a room, wondering how to survive, how to move forward, how to exist with each other. And we always have a choice to step out into the world, to learn and hope and try for better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. To make society possible, to find and build community, to embrace each other and be curious about each other, to try and understand what the person speaking in tongues is trying to say to you, and what we can do with all of that wind and fire.
My name is Clarice Dombeck. I am a, my name is Clarice Dombeck. I was born and raised in North Omaha. I have a background in Black Studies, Sociology, and Urban Studies. I'm a community organizer, creative placemaker, and urban farmer. I consider myself an introvert. However, my care for community forces me to be extroverted. I also consider myself a servant leader, and I see leadership as an opportunity to serve others, to build community, to share power, and to co-create meaningful change. I serve on several community-based nonprofits, one of them being Elevate Omaha, that centers youth in the civic engagement process. I am on a newly formed community board called the Joy Ambition, which works to bring free and fun events to North Omaha. In addition to my service on those two community boards, I'm on a couple of different technical committees, Metro's Technical Advisory Committee, as well as Heartland 2050 Technical Committee as well. And then finally, in addition to my work on those different committees, I'm the organizer of Healing Roots African Diaspora Garden. A question was asked earlier. I think it was something along the lines of like, what brought you joy this week, or what filled your cup this week? For me, that was my opportunity to get out in the garden and plant with young people from my neighborhood. In all those roles on these different committees and boards, and through my work at the nonprofit organization I work for, my values and mission are really centered in a couple of different things. So mobility justice. Mobility justice is our right to move freely, safely, and joyfully through our neighborhoods, community, and city. I've been able to move that vision of mobility justice forward for my community in a couple of different ways. I've been grateful enough to or I've had the opportunity to work on the North Omaha Trail Project. And I'm not sure if y'all are familiar, but the North Omaha Trail is a multimodal public health infrastructure and walking trail, biking trail, running trail. You can use it for whatever suits you and suits your needs. It goes from 24th in Ohio to 31st in Sprague. In addition to it being a multimodal walking trail and public health infrastructure, it's also an arts and cultural trail. So through my work on the trail, I've been able to work with lots of community members and organizations and organizing bike rides and community walks and tree plantings and seed bombings and just having a way to bring community together in this place and really activate it in a way that hasn't been before. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with the history of the North Freeway, but the North Freeway, when it was built, it divided our community in North Omaha. So the 24th Street corridor and the North 30th Street corridor are two major neighborhoods where businesses used to thrive, where communities used to thrive as well. And when the North Freeway came through, it displaced over 1,100 households and 50 businesses. And the North Omaha Trail project that I've been a part of has really been used as a tool to restitch the fabric of our community in that way, and at the same time providing people with a mobility and transportation option to get through our neighborhoods and community in a safe way. The other area that I get to work in is transportation equity. So transportation equity confronts injustices in our transportation infrastructure and seeks to meet the needs of all community members. And historically, transportation projects have negatively impacted Black and brown communities. And right now, there is a movement at all levels across the country to address it. And again, through my work, I have the opportunity to be a part of the Thriving Community Initiative, which is a federal initiative that was put forward by the U.S. Department of Transportation to address systemic issues in our communities related to transportation infrastructure. So we were able to partner with MAPA, the city of Omaha, and then the organization that I work for, Spark, to look at the impacts that the North Freeway has had on our community, and then co-create some solutions around redressing some of those issues. And I'm not sure if you all are aware, but unfortunately in Omaha, Black and Indigenous people are 8 to 13 more times likely to be in fatal accidents while walking, cycling, or driving. So both the trail as well as this Thriving Community Initiative is really aiming to help reduce some of those disparities. And then the last thing that I will talk about is the garden and how it relates to food justice. So Healing Roots African Diaspora Garden is a Black-led community garden that is located on 24th and Pratt. We are centered in honoring the people, plants, and gardening practices of the African diaspora. And what that means is ensuring that community members have access to nutritious, free, and culturally appropriate foods. And the reason why I really started that garden was because of my grandmother. So my grandmother was a sharecropper from Mount Bayou, Mississippi. She had a 3rd grade education, and she barely knew how to read and write. But her and the rest of my ancestors, they had a great amount of skill and knowledge around farming, and just a great relationship with the land. And my grandmother passed that love of the land and community and stewardship onto my mother, and then my mother passed that on to me as well. Yeah, so that is some of the areas that I work in. Like I said, I am a introvert, but my care for community definitely pushes me to be an extrovert and just to do good work and provide service. So thank you for having me today. I appreciate it.